The darkness in a coal mine isn't just an absence of light. It is a physical weight that presses against your chest until you forget how to breathe. Silas felt the pressure change in his ears. Before he heard the sound, a low, grinding groan from the earth itself, like a sleeping giant turning over in a stone bed. He looked at the roof bolts he had just installed, steel fingers meant to hold up a mountain, and watched as the rock around them began to splinter. He didn't think of the coal. He didn't think of the paycheck. He thought of the empty chair at his kitchen table, and he realized he might never fill it again. The alarm clock on the bedside table didn't buzz. It clicked, a sharp, mechanical sound that cut through the silence of 4 a.m., like a pickaxe striking slate. Silas Thorne didn't groan. He didn't roll over. He simply opened his eyes, staring at the ceiling fan that hadn't spun in 3 years, collecting dust just like his lungs were collecting the fine, black powder of the Iron Ridge mine. He sat up, the mattress springs protesting under his weight. At 52, Silas moved with the stiffness of a man whose joints had been ground down by years of crouching in spaces no taller than a kitchen table. He rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the grit that never seemed to wash out of his pores, no matter how hard he scrubbed with the orange soap. The house was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that felt heavy, distinct from the silence of the woods outside. He walked to the kitchen, the linoleum cold against his calloused feet. He started the coffee pot, the gurgling sound familiar and comforting. While it brewed, he looked out the window toward the silhouette of the ridge. The mountain loomed over the town of Blackwood Creek, a massive, dark shoulder shrugging against the starry sky. It was beautiful, in a way, but Silas knew better. He knew the tunnels honeycombed inside it, the miles of darkness, the methane pockets, waiting like coiled vipers. He poured his coffee, black, and drank it, standing up. He pulled on his work clothes. The denim was stiff, stained, permanently gray. He laced his boots, pulling the strings tight enough to cut circulation, just the way he liked it. It made him feel secure. He grabbed his lunch pail, a metal box that had belonged to his father before Himan checked the contents. A ham sandwich, an apple, and a note from Clara. He didn't read the note yet. That was for the break. That was the ritual. If he read it now, he wouldn't have anything to look forward to when the darkness got too loud. He grabbed his keys and headed out the door, the screen door slamming shut with a rattle that echoed down the empty street. The drive to the mine was a convoy of headlights cutting through the mist. Pickup trucks, mostly Fords and Chevys, rusted around the wheel wells, wound their way up the street. Silas knew every pothole, every curve. He parked in his usual spot, the gravel crunching under his tires. The bathhouse smelled of damp concrete, old sweat, and sulfur. It was the smell of brotherhood. Men nodded to each other. Few words spoken. What was there to say? They all knew the job. They all knew the risk. "Morning, Silas," a young voice called out. It was heavy with sleep, but trying to sound tough. Silas looked over. It was Miller, the new guy. Only 19. "Morning, Miller," Silas grunted, opening his locker. "You check your self-rescuer." Miller nodded eagerly. "Checked it twice, Silas." Silas paused, looking the kid in the eye. "Check it again." The mountain doesn't care if you checked it twice. It cares if it works. They moved to the lamp room, grabbing their batteries and helmets. The cap lamps clicked on, beams of light cutting through the gloom of the staging area. They looked like fireflies preparing to fly into the throat of a beast. The Mantrapa low, steel cart designed to shuttle men into the depths waited on the tracks. Silas climbed in, his knees knocking against the metal side. The wheels screeched as the motor engaged, and they began the descent. The square of daylight at the mine mouth grew smaller, shrinking from a window to a postage stamp, then to a pinprick, and finally it was gone. They were in the world of the mole now. 2 miles in, the air changed. It grew cooler, damp, and tasted metallic. The mantrip rattled and shook, the noise deafening, preventing any real conversation. Silas let his mind drift back to the surface, to the reason he was sitting in this rattling cage instead of working a register at the hardware store. Clara, his daughter, was 22, bright-eyed, with a smile that could light up a room faster than any methane flare. but her kidneys were failing. The doctors in Charleston used words like dialysis and transplant list and the insurance covered some, but not the travel, not the meds, not the time off. He remembered the conversation they'd had last night. She was sitting on the porch, wrapped in a quilt, looking frail. "Dad," she had said, "you don't have to pick up the Saturday shifts. I can get a loan." Silas had laughed. A short, sharp bark. "A loan? With what collateral?" "Clara, no. I'm the father," he had told her, his voice softer then. "My job is to dig. Your job is to get better. That's the deal." She had squeezed his hand, her fingers thin and cold. He felt that squeeze now, vibrating through the steering wheel of the Mantrip. He squeezed back against the cold steel of the cart. The debt was a hole deeper than any mine shaft. Every overtime hour, every extra ton of coal, was a few more dollars toward keeping her alive. It was a simple equation. His back, his lungs, his life, in exchange for hers. It was a trade he would make 1,000 times over without blinking. The Mantrip jerked to a halt. Section 4. This was the deep cut. They were retreat mining today, robbing the pillars. It was the most dangerous method in mining. You dig out the coal pillars that hold up the roof as you back out of the room, letting the mountain collapse behind you in a controlled crash. Controlled. That was the word the engineers used. Silas knew there was no such thing as truly controlling a mountain. You just persuaded it to wait a few seconds longer. He climbed out of the cart, his boots sinking into the mixture of mud and coal dust that floored the tunnel. The continuous miner machine sat like a dormant dragon, its massive cutting head resting on the ground. The operator, a man named Big Dave, was already checking the hydraulic lines. "She's leaking fluid on the left side." Dave shouted over the ventilation fans. "Just keep her running." "Dave," Silas yelled back. "We got a quota." Silas was the roof bolter. His job was to drill into the ceiling the top and insert long steel rods to bind the layers of rock together, creating a beam that wouldn't collapse. It was an art form. You had to listen to the rock. You had to feel the vibrations in the drill steel. He positioned his machine, the twin boom drills, rising up to meet the gray slate roof. The drill screamed as it bit into the rock. Dust, despite the water sprays, filled the air, swirling in the cone of his cap lamp. He worked with a rhythm born of decades. Drill, retract, insert glue, insert bolt, spin, tighten, drill, retract, glue, bolt, spin, tighten. It was a dance with gravity. Every bolt was a defiance of nature. Above his head were millions of tons of sandstone and shale, pressing down, wanting to close this unnatural gap. Silas was the only thing stopping it. He thought of Clara again. He thought of the stack of bills on the kitchen counter, secured with a rubber band. $4,000 for the last round of treatment. He drilled another hole. $4,000. He shoved the steel bolt in. $4,000. He tightened the nut until the torque wrench clicked. One more bolt, one more dollar. Lunchtime came 4 hours later. The crew gathered in a crosscut, a small tunnel connecting to main airways, where the ventilation was decent. They sat on buckets or piles of timber, switching off their main lights to save battery, eating by the dim glow of their side lamps. Silas opened his pail. He took out the note. "Dad, please be careful. I made stew for dinner. Love." See, he smiled, the cold dust around his eyes crinkling. He took a bite of his sandwich. It tasted like ham and limestone. "Hear about the layoffs over in Kentucky?" Miller asked, his mouth full. "Shut down the whole Darby Fork." Big Dave grunted. "Gas prices. Or regulations. Or the wind blew the wrong way. Don't matter why. Just matters who." "Rock sounds funny today," Silas said suddenly. The men went quiet. When a veteran bolter talks about the sound of the rock, you listen. "Funny how?" Dave asked, wiping his mouth with a rag. "Tight," Silas said, singing. "When the drill hits, it's ringing too high. Too much tension." "We're almost done with this panel," the foreman, a man named Henderson, said. 2 more cuts, then we pull back. Just get it done. Silas nodded slowly, but the unease sat in his stomach like a stone. He packed his pail away. They went back to work. The continuous miner roared to life, its tungsten teeth chewing into the coal seam. The black rock shattered, pouring onto the conveyor belt that whisked it away to the surface. The noise was a physical assault, a constant thrum that vibrated the marrow of their bones. Silas moved his bolter forward. He drilled. The rock screamed. He paused. Looking up at the roof, he saw a thin line, a hairline fracture, running perpendicular to the cut. "Dave," he shouted, "hold up!" But the roar of the miner drowned him out. Then the air pressure dropped. It was sudden, a vacuum effect that popped their ears. The ventilation curtain flapped violently, then went still. The dust in the air stopped swirling and seemed to hang suspended. It sounded like a gunshot from a cannon. The roof didn't just fall, it exploded. A massive slab of sandstone, the size of a school bus, sheared off directly above the continuous miner. The impact shook the floor so hard, Silas was thrown from his seat. Darkness. Absolute, choking darkness, as the dust cloud instantly blotted out the lights. Then the noise of grinding, tearing sound of rock chewing on steel. "Dave!" Silas screamed, scrambling to his feet, coughing the thick dust. "Back! Get back!" Henderson's voice cut through the chaos. Silas fumbled for his light. Wiping the lens, the beam cut through the dust, revealing a wall of rubble where the machine had been. The tunnel was blocked. The way out was gone. "Miladev?" Silas scrambled over the loose rock. He found Mila huddled near the rib, shaking but unhurt. "I'm here, Silas. I'm here," Mila cried, but there was no answer from Big Dave. Silas crawled toward the blockage. He could see the twisted metal of the continuous miner's canopy. "Dave," he yelled again, putting his ear to a gap in the rocks. A faint groan echoed back. He was alive, but the roof was still working. Small rocks pattered down like rainthaw warning signs of a secondary collapse. "We have to move this rock," Silas shouted to Henderson. "He's pinned." Henderson looked at the roof, his face pale beneath the grime. "Silas, look at the top. It's cutting. If we move that rock, the whole section comes down." Silas looked. The crack he had seen earlier had widened. The mountain was groaning, a low-frequency vibration that rattled his teeth. They were trapped on the wrong side of the fall, and the roof was ready to finish the job. Time loses its meaning underground. There is no sun to track, no shadows to lengthen. There is only the battery indicator on your cap lamp and the rhythm of your own breathing. They had moved back to a safe spot, a reinforced intersection 50 yards from the collapse. There were 4 of them: Silas, Miller, Henderson, and a shuttle car operator named Jenkins. Big Dave was still under the rock. They could hear him sometimes, calling out for water or for his mother. It tore at Silas's soul. Every instinct screamed to go dig him out. But the roof was unstable. To go back was suicide. They sat in the dark to conserve power. "The phone line is cut," Henderson said, his voice flat. "They know we're down." The belt stopped. "The fan pressure monitors will show a blockage. Rescue is coming." "How long?" Miller asked. His voice was high, thin. "Hours," Silas said. "Maybe a day. Depends on how much rock came down behind us." He reached out and gripped the boy's shoulder. "Breathe slow, Miller. Shallow breaths. Save the oxygen." Silas leaned his head back against the coal rib. He closed his eyes. The hallucinations usually started after 6 hours of darkness and bad air. He wasn't there yet, but the memories were flooding in. He saw Clara's face when she was 5, covered in chocolate ice cream. He saw it the day he buried Sarah, the rain turning the cemetery dirt into mud that looked just like the floor of this mine. He saw the bills. The numbers danced in the dark. $4,000. $10,000. "I can't breathe," Jenkins whispered. "The air is getting stale." Silas sniffed. The air was heavy, dead. The ventilation was cut off. Carbon dioxide was building up. "Put your rescuers on," Silas ordered. They donned the self-contained self-rescuers. The devices were awkward, a mouthpiece and a nose clip that forced you to breathe chemically generated oxygen. It was hot and tasted like dry metal, but it was life. Silas sat there, the device in his mouth, isolation wrapping around him. He thought of the note in his lunch pail. "I made stew for dinner." He wondered if the stew was cold by now. He wondered if Clara was pacing the living room, watching the phone. He felt a sudden surge of anger, not at the mine, not at the boss, but at the circumstance. He had given his body to this mountain for 30 years. He had broken bones, breathed dust-mist birthdays, and now? Was it going to take his last breath, too? Was it going to leave Clara alone with nothing but debt and a flag-folded coffin? No, Silas thought. Not today. He stood up. The movement was sudden. "What are you doing?" Henderson mumbled around his mouthpiece. Silas pulled the rescuer from his mouth for a second. "I'm going to check on Dave." The roof settled. "I haven't heard a rock fall in 20 minutes. "Silas! Don't!" Henderson warned. "It's a death trap. He's one of us," Silas growled. "I ain't leaving him to die alone while we sit here." He reclamped the nose clip and moved toward the collapse. The walk was terrifying. The beam of his light shook. He reached the pile of rubble. He crawled into the gap, the jagged rocks tearing at his uniform, and found Dave's hand sticking out from under a slab, e grabbed Italiano. It was warm. He squeezed. Dave squeezed back. Silas sat there in the crush zone, holding his friend's hand. He couldn't move the rock. He couldn't free him, but he could be there. He could offer presence. He hummed a tune, a vibration in his throat that traveled down his arm to Dave. It was an old hymn, Amazing Grace. Minutes turned to hours. Silas's legs went numb. His lights began to dim, the yellow beam turning to a sickly orange. The darkness was closing in. He thought he saw Sarah standing in the tunnel, wearing her white Sunday dress. She was smiling. "Not yet, Silas," she seemed to say. "Not yet." Then a sound. Not the groan of the earth. Not the drip of water. A mechanical sound. A drill. Far off. Muffled, but distinct. Silas squeezed Dave's hand. "You hear that, Dave? They're knocking." The sound grew louder. It was coming from the other side of the fall. The rescue team was drilling a probe hole. Then, voices. Muffled shouting, Silas tapped on a roof bolt with his wrench. Clang, clang, clanged the universal signal. "We are here." The drilling stopped. A voice boomed through the rock, faint but audible. "Sound off. Who's there?" Silas ripped the mouthpiece out. "Torre Miller Henderson Jenkins." And Davies pinned, "We need lifting bags." The relief was physical. A wave of nausea and tears. But the work wasn't done. It took another 6 hours for the rescue team to clear enough debris to reach them. They brought hydraulic jacks. They lifted the slab off Dave's legs. When they finally loaded Dave onto the stretcher, he was unconscious but breathing. The rescue team men from the shift above, faces grim and determined, helped the rest of them stumble over the rubble. The walkout seemed to take a lifetime. Silas refused the stretcher. He walked. He had to walk. He had to prove to the mountain that he could still walk. They reached the fresh air base. The cool, clean wind hit Silas's face like a bucket of water. He ripped the rescuer off and took a deep breath. It tasted of diesel and ozone, but it was the sweetest thing he had ever tasted. The ride up the elevator was silent. When the doors opened, the light was blinding. It was nighttime outside, but the floodlights of the mine yard were blazing. There were ambulances. There were news crews. And there were families. Silas scanned the crowd, his eyes stinging. He saw her. Clara. She was wrapped in a blanket, standing by the gate, her face pale, tears streaming down her cheeks. She broke through the line of safety officers. "Dad," she screamed. Silas dropped to his knees. His legs finally gave out. She collided with him, Wrapping her thin arms around his coal-blackened neck, he buried his face in her shoulder, sobbing. The tough miner, the roof bolter, the man of stone, finally broke. "I'm here," he whispered into her hair. "I'm here," I promised. 3 months later, the kitchen was warm. The smell of coffee filled the air. Silas sat at the table. His leg in a cast had torn a ligament during the escape, something he hadn't even felt at the time. Clara placed a plate of eggs in front of him. She looked better. The color was back in her cheeks. The union benefits from the accident, combined with a community fundraiser organized by Big Dave's family, had covered the immediate bills. Dave had lost his leg, but he was alive. He was carving wood on his porch right now. Silas looked at the classified ads in the paper. He circled a job opening at the lumberyard. It paid half of what the mine did. No benefits. Hard work. "You going to call them?" Clara asked, pouring herself a cup. Silas looked out the window at the ridge. The leaves were turning, a blaze of orange and red against the gray sky. The mine was still there. It would always be there. But the fear of that darkness was something he couldn't shake. "Yeah," Silas said, picking up a pen. "I think I will." He looked at his hands. The coal dust was gone from the surface, but he knew it was still there. Deep in the creases, deep in his lungs. You never really leave the mine. It stays with you. "But first," Silas said, pushing the paper away, "let's eat." He picked up his fork. The sun broke through the clouds, casting a square of light onto the kitchen table. It illuminated the scars on his knuckles, the map of a life spent in the dark, so that others could have the light.